Yeah, so let's go through this activity and then we'll go over the exam, talk a little bit of exam prep stuff. All right. So, and with these, feel free to interrupt, pause, ask questions. The goal is to get really comfortable with this material. So if I'm given an answer going through it and it's different than what your group said, or you have a question about why I'm saying what I say, please don't hesitate. Interrupt me. Let me know your question. We can go over it together. That's the goal. The goal is to get really comfortable, really confident with these problems prior to the exam. So, all right. So this first grouping was based on the whole GameStop stock trading thing that was going on the last week. It was super weird. That was when I was going on right when I wrote this. So I figured it'd be a fun occasion to ask some questions. So, okay. So what does the law say about market manipulation with the buying and selling of stocks? Here we have a straightforwardly factual question, I think. Right? How would we answer this question? We just literally find the legal statute and read it, or say what the legal statute says. And so therefore it's factual. We just have to describe, literally the words on the page, and we now know what the law says. But if any of you are interested in the law, maybe want to be a lawyer, even if you just watched a lot of legal TV shows, you probably know simply knowing what the law literally says frequently is not enough to figure out what does or does not fall under it, right? There's frequently ambiguities. There's frequently sort of odd circumstances that come up. And so I wanted to know, would my specific individual action be illegal based on what the law says? We've got to go beyond the mere factual question. We have to interpret the law. And so we're at an interpretive question here. We need to know what the law means. How does the law apply in particular cases? And notice, you'd sort of have to almost answer this first question before you could even start answering the second one, right? You need to know what the law literally says before you can start interpreting it. But just knowing what the law literally says, there's still probably going to be a whole host of legal questions, legal conflicts, legal disputes that emerge anyway. All right, so let's move on then. So would my actions help me make a lot of money in this case? Here now we're talking about doing things, right? What should I do? What's going to be the result of me doing something? That's an instrumental question. If I'm asking any kind of doing question, I'm asking an instrumental question. Should I do this? What will happen if I do this? What's the right way to accomplish it? Anything like that, any kind of doing question like that, right? That's instrumental. We're now evaluating the facts to figure out what should I do on their basis. And the last question, would my action be right? That one, pretty obviously, we got an ethical question. Again, we're still going beyond the facts, but now we're asking about what are sort of the ethical ramifications of those facts.
Would ethical and moral be interchangeable terms in this case?
In this context, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and in some context, you might even actually want to even throw legal in, like where is something legal in some context. Now here we put it in different terms. In some context, it might even be like, is it legal to steal? You almost might think of that as an ethical question in some very specific cases, anyway. Right. This is more like, what does this specific law mean? Is it in general, illegal to steal? You could maybe think of that as ethical. So this is indeed ethical in a pretty broad sense of the term. Yeah. Good. So with these first four, any thoughts, questions, everything more or less how people were sort of imagining things to go? All right. Then let's go to the next little pod of questions. And here, there's going to be some that I think are a little bit more ambiguous here, particularly this last one. I think this last one probably is the hardest question of any of these to figure out what it is. And I think it's because there's a couple different ways you could maybe interpret the question. So let's start going through this. So this little pot of questions came up. What I actually study mainly is history. That's my sort of area, history of philosophy. And so I go back a lot to ancient Greek and Roman stuff, and I read a lot of things that sort of are comparing what happened in the past with what happened today. So that's sort of what was motivating some of these questions. So first question, did the pipes in ancient Rome that were used to supply water to the large cities contain lead? And here again, we have a factual question, right? This is straightforwardly factual. Right? How would we answer the question? We would just describe what the pipes were like in ancient Rome. And so, yeah, and I think this one's pretty straightforward. Maybe as helpful for the next couple questions, the answer to this question is yes. The Romans indeed made lead is a very malleable metal. It was really easy to manipulate. So indeed, the Romans did make their pipes out of lead. Now they didn't know lead was dangerous, right? But they indeed did this. Okay. So then we might ask, did lead poisoning from a contaminated water supply help lead to the downfall of the Roman Empire? Right? Here we're going beyond just the facts. We know the facts will answer. We know that pipes had lead in it. We know that as a result of that, some lead would have seeped into the water supply. We know that. But we have to, just knowing that's not enough to fully answer this question. Let me tell you, historians debate this with great fervor, the answer to this question, and they agree on the facts. There's not a factual disagreement that they're having. What they're disagreeing is how we should interpret those facts. What do those facts mean? What's their significance? This is an example of an interpretive question. What meaningful impact does it have? We have to sort of interpret what the facts mean. Maybe we have to compare facts that we know about lead in the water supply with other things we know about Roman history or Roman architecture or whatever, right? And so therefore, this is an interpretive question. But so too is this next question. This next question also isn't going to be an interpretive one. And the reason why is because now we're comparing two different sets of facts. Right? Facts about US water system and facts about the Roman water system. And when we're comparing two different sets of facts in this way, we're sort of trying to interpret, figure out what's important, what's significant, what's the meaning of things. And the reason why I bring this question up is that the pipes that also are in our water system also have lead in them. Our pipes are not as much, they're not made the same way, and it's not as much lead, and the risk is lesser, but our pipes have lead in them too, for what that's worth. So then, how similar are those situations really, right? That requires some comparison, it therefore requires interpretation. This last one, I think, is the trickiest, and I think the reason this last one is tricky is because the question can admit of kind of a couple different interpretations, actually. So, does the United States face a serious risk of collapse as a result of the environmental status of its water supply? One way of interpreting this question is that it's basically just the same kind of thing that was being asked in question number 6, right? Question number 6 was sort of being asked about interpreting past. This is being asked about interpreting the present. And indeed, I actually think that's probably the most natural way of reading this question is as actually another interpretive question. So the same thing as what's the significance of the Roman water system? What's the significance of the US water system? As written, I think this is probably the most natural way of interpreting it, of taking the question. But, when I ask, does the United States face a serious risk of collapse as a result of the environmental status of its water supply? What do you all naturally think? You all naturally think, should we do something about this situation? Right? And I think that's also a perfectly reasonable way of interpreting the question. If you go in that route, then you are looking at an instrumental question. Cody, go ahead. You can unmute yourself while I finish writing this out.
So for number 8, I actually put evaluative because it's asking us what could happen. Would that be some way you would interpret it, or did I just completely miss the point?
No, you're not completely off. That way of going with it would be closer to seeing it as an an instrumental question. So for evaluative isn't really going to be one of the answers to these questions. There are 3 different kinds of evaluative questions. So I always want you to tell me what specific kind of evaluative question you think it is.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, but yeah, if you do read this as sort of like evaluating what it is that we should do about the situation, instrumental certainly works. Just if you're going to say instrumental, it's got to be some kind of doing question. It's got to have something to do with action in some way. But it works certainly as an evaluative instrumental question. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you. I was just about that.
Good. Awesome. Any other questions for this one? Like I said, I think this one is indeed the most challenging of them. And there's another one that's a little bit ambiguous later on. I think 12 could also maybe be ambiguous in sort of a similar way. I'm going to try to give you on the exam questions that are pretty not ambiguous, where there's really only one way I think that it makes sense to take the question. Indeed, actually, there'll be multiple choice questions. You won't even have to give any justification on the exam. But it can be helpful to sort of recognize for this exercise anyway, some cases where it can actually be a little bit ambiguous precisely how you read these things. And for us to sort of see it just as different ways of seeing what it is that the question is actually asking. So any questions, people good here? All right, awesome. Then let's move on to the last pod of questions. The last pod of questions has no special significance. I was hungry for pizza. And indeed, I ordered a pizza, and it was great. So it was a good time was had by all. All right. So does Rito's Pizzeria make the best pizza in town? So you might be thinking in terms of the question Cody just asked about actually sort of like, this does seem like it's some kind of evaluative question, right? If we're being asked to say what's the best, yeah, that sounds like we're being asked to evaluate things to some extent. So the question is maybe what kind of evaluation are we being asked to do? It doesn't seem like a moral one, I would say, right? Like it'd be pretty weird to interpret this question as asking like, what's the most moral pizza? I mean, maybe it could happen, I guess, right? But that sounds like a kind of weird interpretation. Similarly, it doesn't sound like I'm asking like what pizza does the best job of making money. That would be maybe an kind of instrumental question, right? Where we're sort of like, who does what they do the best, maybe. But this seems more to be what we're going to call an aesthetic question. It's a question about taste or beauty. And I think anything of this sort, it's going to be an example of something that's aesthetic. Similarly, if we're asking about art, usually we're asking an aesthetic question about art, right? Now, you might be thinking, well, isn't this kind of a subjective question? And maybe it is. I mean, that could well be right. But note that we can still inquire about it. Note that it's still something that people can and do debate, say, right? We can sort of argue. I could argue with my friend who makes the best pizza in town, right? And we can indeed give reasons to justify it. And indeed, this is why things like Yelp reviews exist or whatever, right? Like the reason why restaurant reviews exist, even though my taste probably isn't the same as the taste of the person who's writing the review, nevertheless, a well-written review of a restaurant probably can tell me interesting or helpful things that I can use to figure out how likely I am to like the pizza. Maybe if they're like, the sauce was kind of great, but I thought the crust was amazing. Well, if I love sauce, that's useful information to me. It helps me guess how I'm going to feel about it. So aesthetic questions maybe are the most subjective-y seeming questions of the ones we're going to look at this semester. But even still, we can inquire about them because you still can give reasons to sort of justify why you like one pizza better than another pizza, or why you like one album better than another album, or one painting more than another painting. So good here. I know these aesthetic questions are probably the weirdest. Anyone had any issues with these? All right. Everyone's good. Then let's keep going on then. So what are the ingredients of Rico's Pizza? Here we're back to a factual question, right? We answer this question just by listing the ingredients. Just describing what the pizza's like. Now let's move on to this one. This one's interesting. Would the pizza be improved if they changed the recipe? Again, I would say this sounds interpretive. Oh, sorry, not interpretive, evaluative. This sounds evaluative again, right? We're being sort of asked to evaluate things. Would it be better if things changed? And again, so the question is, what kind of evaluation are we being asked to do? I mean, again, it would be weird to read this as asking an ethical question, right? Like maybe it is, like maybe it's like, maybe if it's more ethically sourced ingredients, would it become a more moral pizza? Maybe I can imagine someone asking that, but that's not the most natural way of taking this. Similarly, it's not a question about like them making money or something, right? Like that's more than 12. So it doesn't seem like it's going to be instrumental either. Again, we seem to have a kind of aesthetic question here. Still talking about evaluating the taste or the beauty of the pizza in some broad sense. Again, I'll think of all of these in pretty broad senses of the term, as a broad sense of the term. And so that seems to be the kind of evaluation we're being asked to make here. The last one is another one that I think is kind of ambiguous. I think it's ambiguous in kind of a very similar way to the way that 8 was ambiguous. Would Rito's Pizzeria make more money if they changed the recipe? If you see this as talking about like Rita's actually doing something, it would be an instrumental question. If you think we're talking about doing here, actually taking a concrete action rather than maybe some abstract hypothetical or something, it makes sense to see this as an instrumental question. We're trying to sort of figure out what results are likely to follow from Rito's taking a particular kind of action with respect to their sort of like financial well-being or something like that. That would be sort of a classical instrumental question. If you see it more as kind of an abstract question, you could maybe view this as interpretive. If this is just a question of predicting maybe like what could happen in the future rather than sort of some concrete plan of action, I would also think it could make sense to read this question as an interpretive one. Either, again, I'm not going to try not to give you one this ambiguous in the exam. Depending on which reading you gave, I think either of them would make sense in this context. Just remember, if you're saying it's an instrumental question, you're talking about action or doing something. Whereas if it's interpretive, you're just talking about what something means, what it would be significant, how it would be significant. Any questions in any of these? This last pod? Anything in this last pod?
I had a quick question about number 11.
Sure.
Could you say that would be an instrumental question because it's like thinking about the usefulness or like the practicality of changing the recipe?
I guess maybe. So if you read it as maybe like about health, like would the pizza have been made healthier if they changed the recipe? Then I think that definitely would work as instrumental. That would definitely work, right? So if it's improved with respect to something like healthfulness, sure. If we mean improved with respect to taste, though, that's gotta probably be aesthetic. Taste isn't really for instrumental stuff. We're really talking more like pragmatically practical kinds of changes, or practical kinds of doings, rather than things like taste or things like morality. Is that helpful? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, because if you read it, and again, that's why sort of evaluative is a broad category, right? It's sort of, you could read this question, would Rito's Pizza be made better if they changed the recipe? Well, made better in what regard? Made better with respect to something sort of practical, sure, then instrumental works. Made better morally, ethical. Made better via taste, aesthetic. Awesome. Any others? Any other or anything else with these topics? Anything from chapter 2 people would like to talk about? All right, great. So let's real quick go over the exam then. Let's just do a little bit, give you a sense of what the exams are going to look like. So this first exam is intended to be pretty short based on past experience. Most of you are going to do reasonably well. I still are, studying all that, but people tend to do pretty well with this first one. The goal of it is really just to give you a feel of what the exams are going to look like. So let's just go through that a little bit. So they're on Canvas. You'll have the entire weekend to start them. Once you start it, you'll have 30 minutes to get the exam finished. So, make sure you leave yourself at least 30 minutes to do it within. The exam is worth 20 points. And the way that I sort of think about the exam when I'm writing it and when I'm figuring out how many points to assign the questions is that the number of points in a question is about how many minutes I expect the question to take you. So if there's a 1 point question, my assumption is it should take you about a minute to do it. If there's a 5 point question, it should take you about 5 minutes to do it. That's how I'm sort of aiming, how I'm sort of trying to calibrate it. That's something that you can use a little bit to make sure you're not spending too much time on a question, but also not spending too little time on a question too. If there's a 1 point question, the most I'll ever want you to write is like probably a sentence or two at most. If it's 2 sentences, probably that would be a 2 point question. Whereas a 5 point question, if you only write 1 sentence, you probably have not written enough. I'm probably going to have higher expectations for you all from that question. So this is something you can use to sort of calibrate how long to spend on different portions of the exam. But I'm also always going to give you more time than that. So for this one, I think it'll take you 20 minutes to do this exam, but you have 30. So you have extra time, and you can get time that you can use to do things like maybe go back and review, or if there's a question you're struggling on, maybe spend a little bit longer on some of the questions and not sort of run afoul of things. There'll be 3 broad kinds of questions that'll show up on these exams. There'll be some true, false, multiple choice kind of questions, or maybe like matching kinds of questions. Those will be predominantly in cases where the answers are supposed to be pretty unambiguous, where there's just sort of like a right answer and a wrong answer. For this first exam, there will indeed be some of those. Actually, the gauging what kind of question it is you're looking at will actually be multiple choice questions, because I'm going to at least try to come up with examples that are really unambiguous, where there's only one way of interpreting the question that really makes much sense. There will also be some sort of short answer questions. The short answer questions, again, will usually be like 2 or 3 sentences, where what I'll be looking for is usually for you to do something like defining a concept or talking about how different concepts compare. So let's say, for example, that there was a question on the exam that was something like, what is an inquiry? Hint, 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 hint. If there was a question that was something like, what is an inquiry, right? I would expect you to have, 2, 3 sentences, something like that, where you sort of just define the term. Or maybe I might ask you to compare how 2 terms are related to one another. So maybe how is a debate related to an inquiry? How are they different, or something like that, where you're comparing things, right? And the last kind of question that'll be on the exam are sort of longer, sort of more short essay kind of questions, where maybe I'm looking for more like a paragraph, where you'll be sort of solving some particular problem, basically. And usually in that kind of question, the key will be how you justify the answer that you give. There's not going to be a lot of questions like that on this exam. There'll only be really 1 question like that, I think, on this one. But later on in the semester, particularly once we start looking at inductive arguments, which will be most of the semester, actually, it'll be a lot of these sort of short essay kind of questions. And what will matter isn't really even so much the answer you give, but how you justify the answer that you give. And problems like that are where sort of showing your work, or not even showing your work exactly, but explaining your work, explaining the reasoning that led you to answer the question the way that you did. That's where those will be sort of significant. Mostly for this exam, it'll be sort of like short answer stuff and some multiple choice stuff. That'll be most of this exam. Let's see, is there anything else that I have? So if anyone has a disabilities accommodation that gives you extra time on the exam, good idea, just email me, particularly for this first one, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. I should already have the letter from the Disabilities Resources Center, so it shouldn't be necessary, but it's, some things are running late, some emails have gotten lost. Last semester, an email got lost in the mail and I didn't get it halfway through the semester. So it's probably a good idea, if you are sort of owed an accommodation, get in touch with me, particularly just for this first one, so we can all make sure everyone's on the same page. You get the accommodations that you're sort of owed. I think that's all I have for the exam. I'm not gonna I'm gonna try to get them graded pretty fast. Within about a week and a half or so is usually gonna be my goal. Probably won't always happen, but at least that'll be my goal, is to get them back to you about a week from when you do them, or a week and a half from when you did them. I'm not really going to write comments on your exams, but what I'll do is around the same time that I email you and tell you that the exams are graded and available, I'll also try to post a video where I go through the exam. So, and you'll be able to sort of go back and sort of get a sense of what I was looking for when I was grading things. If anyone ends up with questions after that process, though, after you've gone through the video, please let me know. I'm happy to go over why I scored things the way that I did. If you think you deserve some additional points, maybe you're right. Make the case and see if you can persuade me. I'm persuadable about these things. Usually it's a lot of grading in a very short period of time. It is entirely possible that I might have missed something. So I'm always happy to have that conversation. Don't hesitate for it. Yeah. Any questions, thoughts, comments, concerns about the exam? All right, then I think let's call it for today. My recommendation: do the homework problems for chapters 1 and 2 tonight, or by the end of tonight. And then if you have questions, that's what office hours are for. On Friday, I've got my office hours. You can come to them. We can go over anything anyone wants to go over. I could also make appointments tomorrow too, probably, if my scheduled office hours don't work for you. So just let me know if you want to do that. Otherwise, I will see you all later. Probably Tuesday. That's at least the rumors, that I'll see you all here on Tuesday remotely. If not, I'll see half of you on Tuesday, half of you on Thursday. Either way, I'll make sure to send you an email as soon as I get confirmation about what next week will look like, so you can all plan around that. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Absolutely.